Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the reading of The Executioner's Daughter by Laura E. Williams. We were left off on Chapter 2, and now we're on to Chapter 3. Lily watched her mother as they prepared the evening meal, as her mother chopped and sliced. She seemed to lose the tension from her face and shoulders. She was even humming by the time they were through. Once the table was set and supper was heating over the fire, Alice took Lily's hand. "Come, walk with me." Lily smiled. She and her mother often used to walk together, with Alice pointing out herbs and flowers and telling Lily their medicinal purposes. But lately her mother hadn't had time, or perhaps it was more a matter of desire. They took the path Lily had made along the edge of the forest. "There is a cluster of yarrow," Lily pointed out. "Aye," Alice agreed. "And yonder are some wolfsbane, that you must never pick because 'tis poisonous." Lily finished for her mother with a laugh. "I remember your lessons well," she assured her. The two wound around some trees and cut across corners of fields. Lily didn't fear a taunting crowd of children with her mother beside her. Alice suddenly stopped walking. Without a word, she looked up to the sky. Above them circled a pair of doves, their tail feathers pointing out behind them. "How beautiful," Alice said softly. They watched silently as the doves flapped off toward the town. Hand in hand, the two continued to walk aimlessly, heading deeper into the forest. The rotting leaves from season past crushed under their footsteps. When they came to a stream, Alice lay back on the mossy ground. Lily sat by her and wove a garland out of twigs and ferns she found around her. When she placed it on her head, she felt like a princess wearing a crown. "Have you ever seen a princess?" she asked her mother. "Nay, where would I have the chance to see a princess? Or a prince? I've not even seen the king. Only Lord Dunsworth, and he's not such a sight to see." "But you've seen knights," Lily said. "Aye," Alice replied. "At the castle they come and go. They are rather common, in fact." She said it as if they were describing a type of rat. Lily laughed. "Are they all brave and handsome?" "Nay, they fart and spit like any other man." Lily groaned and threw a fern at her mother, who batted it away. "Tell me true," she begged. "I don't know what is true, daughter. I've only seen them from a great distance. They are not interested in the likes of us," she said flatly. Lily gently tugged off her crown and tossed it into the stream. She watched it slide over rocks and tumble through rough water until it was whisked around the bend. She tried to imagine its journey, but she had never been farther in the forest than the old stones from the days of the Druids. Nor had she ever crossed the meadows to see what lay beyond. But if she were a garland sweeping down the stream, or even better, a bird flying high. She took a deep breath. What use was there in imagining such impossible things? She lay down beside her mother and stared up at the evening sky that winked at her from between the overhead leaves. "How did you meet father?" she asked, her voice sounding barely louder than a puff of air. For a long moment, her mother said nothing. Lily thought her mother hadn't heard her, but she didn't want to ask again. Her whole life she'd known that her parents didn't like to talk about the past. She had come to accept this silence, but sometimes she longed for a history. Something more than a story of how the midwife wouldn't attend when Alice's time was near. So Will had to act as a midwife and help bring Lily into the world. "The best midwife in the land," Alice always said at the end of the story, making Lily laugh and her father wince. "He saved me from my fate," Alice said slowly, breaking into Lily's thoughts. "Your father was my own knight, though his armor was black as death." "What do you mean?" The words were barely out of her mouth when her mother sat up in alarm. Then Lily heard the clop of hooves hitting an occasional rock and the clank of buckles and harnesses. Fear shot through her. All travelers in the forest had to be careful, but especially a woman and her daughter, alone and unprotected. They sprang to their feet. Alice grabbed Lily's hand and lifted her skirts with the other. They started running. Lily heard a shout behind them, and her mother pulled her along faster. Whenever Alice glanced behind her, Lily caught a glimpse of her fearful eyes and two bright spots of color on her cheeks. Lily opened her mouth to breathe easier, but still each breath came ragged. She swiped her hair out of her face, tripped over a log, and sprawled forward. The air was knocked out of her. "Come along," Alice panted. "Quickly now!" Lily staggered to her feet. Once again, Her mother took her hand and they ran. The jangle of harnesses seemed to come from many directions, and the pounding hooves beat into her body until she didn't know if it were the horses or her own heartbeat she heard thumping. When they neared the clearing where they lived, they didn't slow until they'd burst out of the forest, gasping for air. Alice bent nearly double. Lily held her arm. She tried to listen for the sound of pursuit, but all she could hear was deep in and out of her own breathing. At last, the racing heart slowed, and Lily wiped a sleeve across her forehead. Alice placed her hands on Lily's shoulders. "We must not tell your father what happened. Do you hear?" she said. Lily nodded. She was used to keeping secrets. She no longer told her parents when children chased her, or if a farmer's wife had come upon her unexpectedly and spit at her. As for telling others, whom would she tell? Alice hugged her. "Father's home now. Let me go in first. You tend to your animals and come later." Lily made her way to the side of the cottage. Now that the danger had passed, anger sparked in her. It seemed she was always running away from something. More like someone. Taunting children. Farmers who chased her. She got too close to their fields. And men on horseback, who could be soldiers of Lord Dunworth or thieves. Running away. It seemed that's all she knew how to do. That and picking herbs. She examined the cages to be sure that they held strong. Then she checked the water and left seeds and wilted lettuce to hold the animals over till morning. Thinking enough time had passed, she went inside. Her father sat in a dark corner. When Lily came in, her mother called them to the table to eat. As her father rose out of the shadows, Lily was shocked to see that he still wore his gloves. While her mother scrubbed her hands raw after an execution, her father simply removed his gloves and placed them on a high shelf. Several years ago, Lily had teetered on a stool to bring them down and play with them while her parents were busy in the apothecary. But the gloves were stiff. Lily had been afraid to do more than nudge them with the tips of her fingers. Looking up from the table where she sat, Alice stiffened when she saw her husband's hands. "Take them off," she said, her voice as sharp as a nettle. Lily winced to hear the harsh sound, so unlike the sweet, happy voice her mother had used only a short time earlier, when they had wandered through the forest. Her father said nothing as he poured himself more ale, and swallowed the entire tankard in one breath. "Take them off," Alice said again. "I'll not sit here while you wear them." She stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the bench behind her. "Why should I?" Will demanded, sounding like his voice might burst through his chest at any moment. "I'll need them again tomorrow." "What? Nay!" Her mother sank back onto the bench. Her shoulders seemed to drown in her dress as understanding swept over her. Lily reached a hand toward her, but her mother flinched away, hurt by the rebuff. Lily clasped her hands together under the table. "Aye," Will said. "The bailiff sent word that there's to be another execution." Lily picked at the food on her small trencher as she watched her father quickly drain and refill his ale a few more times. He didn't eat, and neither did her mother. At last, Alice pushed herself to her feet and passed beyond the leather curtain into the apothecary. Her father stood unsteadily and went out through the front door. A few minutes later, she heard the loud thwacking sound of him splitting wood. Lily peered out the window and could just make out his figure in the darkness. Every time he raised the wood axe, he shrugged his left shoulder as though that gave him more power, and he kept his head tilted to the side as he did whenever he was concentrating. The tankard of ale sat on a log next to him, within easy reach. Lily moved away from the window and cleaned up the table. Blossom whined, and she shooed her outdoors. Then she peeked around the curtain to find her mother, in the gloomy light with only a couple of candles flickering nearby. Alice stood before the long table, sorting piles of herbs. Lily watched for a minute before she realized her mother was simply moving one pile from place to place. Then her mother stopped and leaned against the table, holding herself up with her hands laid against the wood. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Lily longed to rush to her mother and hold her, but what comfort could she give? She could barely calm a wounded rabbit, never mind ease her mother's grief. Uncertain, she stood watching, waiting for a sign that her mother needed her, wanted her, or even knew she was there. But Alice didn't turn around. Slowly, her slender shoulders stopped shaking. They squared, and Alice took a deep breath and then another. Lily's chest felt tight. "Mother?" she said at last. Her mother turned towards Lily, her eyes wet. She opened her arms and Lily ran into them, wishing she could loosen the tears that strained at her throat. but she had worked too long and too hard at keeping them trapped inside, and she didn't know any longer how to unstopper the opening to let them flow. "Dear Lily," her mother crooned, rubbing her back. "I just wanted to comfort you," Lily said against her mother's shoulder. "And so you do." Lily heard the warm smile in her mother's voice. "You are my greatest comfort." "Then why are you sad?" "All the things I must do in life," Alice said heavily. "The executions, the tortures, the—" She paused abruptly and pulled Lily even tighter against her. "I pray that you never have to." Again, she cut herself off. "Never have to what, Mother?" Lily asked. Alice shook her head. "Pay no mind, daughter. 'Tis fate." She gave a short laugh that scratched at Lily's ears. "Sometimes I think I cheated fate, and now fate is laughing at me." Lily understood that fate had a hand in all that happened, but she didn't understand how her mother thought she had cheated it. One did not cheat fate or change one's destiny. "You have me," Lily said, her voice small, afraid this would not be enough. Her mother squeezed her harder. They stood for a long time in the circles of each other's arms. Lily remembered back to when the only place she found solace was cuddled up next to her mother. Her father, so big and dark, often frightened her, though he was never cruel to her. Sometimes he was even kind, bringing her treats and tickling her till she curled into a giggling ball. But until recently, her mother has always been like a blanket, keeping her warm and safe. And that's how she felt right now. Yet Lily also felt protective, as though she too held the power to soothe and comfort. The rain started early the next morning, so that when Lily awoke it was to its patter on the thatched roof of the cottage. She lay on her pallet, listening. It was a good and proper day for an execution, she thought. Somehow it didn't seem fair to put someone to death, when the sun blazed merrily in the sky and the birds sang sweetly. But on a dreary day, when the sky cried for the wicked, it seemed right and just. Then she remembered her father's drunken raging of the night before. He chopped wood deep into the night, taking rest only to quench his thirst. Well after moonrise, he stumbled into the cottage, demanding more ale. He had smashed his tankard on the table so hard the handle broke off, that he'd thrown the vessel into the fire, scattering coals and sending sparks twirling into the cottage. "Where's the ale?" he demanded. "You've drunk it all," Alice said stiffly. In the dark, Will had swept the bowls and jugs off the rickety shelves. He'd knocked away a stack of baskets and tipped over the empty washtub in his futile search for more to drink. Lily had trembled behind her curtain where she hid. Her father had seemed cruel and desperate, not the quiet man who gave medicines and good advice to those who came for help. Not even the sullen man he'd become of late. This raging man she did not recognize. When at last he'd given up searching, his legs buckled underneath him, as he sank onto a bench. Only the faint glow of the embers had illuminated his features. He'd rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. Alice had gone to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come, William," she said calmly. Clumsily he'd risen, leaning heavily on his wife. She led him to their bed, where he lay down with his boots on. "I am cursed," Lily had heard him say in a hoarse whisper, "and have cursed you too." "Sleep," Alice had said, and she started humming a melody that had nothing to do with curses or despair or drunken rages. So, when Lily awakened the next day, with rain in her ears, her mother's song still played in her heart. And that is the end of chapter 3. Hi guys, if you would like more things like this, head on over to my Patreon. We have multiple different tiers, and I can't wait to see you there. Bye!